Hello, my name's Richard Burney and I'm a final year vet student at the University of Nottingham. I undertook this piece of research as part of an intercalated research master's degree in 2019, and today I'll be talking to you about the results from a survey that aims to explore horse owner experience, knowledge and attitudes towards different aspects of equine wound management. The study was approved by the University of Nottingham's Ethics Committee. No animal research was involved. There were no competing interests. Consent was obtained in line with the current regulations, and funding was jointly from the British Horse Society and the University of Nottingham. So traumatic wounds have been consistently described as the second most common emergency condition in the horse, with colic being the first, and they can present in many different ways, and due to this there is a variation in wound outcome. There is currently very limited data exploring the morbidity of wound injury amongst the equine population, particularly for those which are managed in the absence of veterinary treatment and are managed entirely by owners themselves. Delayed or inappropriate treatment has the potential to impact on outcome in terms of prognosis for return to pre-athletic function, the time taken to return to work, and also mortality. Owners are often heavily involved in the treatment of many wounds, and it is important that they work synergistically with both veterinary surgeons and veterinary advice in order to maximise the chances of a positive outcome. Equally, there are currently no published studies available on how owners are managing wounds either prior to or in the absence of veterinary treatment, and it's important we capture data on how these wounds are managed in order that we can address any issues in the future through educational campaigns. And all of these reasons served as a general impetus for carrying out this body of research. So the aim was to investigate horse owners' approach and management towards traumatic equine wound injuries, and to document their previous experience with equine wounds, their confidence and ability in managing different wound injuries, and factors influencing their decision to seek veterinary advice. We also aim to explore the first aid measures owners adopted when faced with different wound injuries. So we designed an online survey that was open to all of those who were over the age of 18 and involved in the care of horses to complete, and they didn't necessarily have to own their own horse. A convenient sample method was used to recruit participants, and this was achieved predominantly through the British Horse Society and the university's social media channels. The survey contained a consent section, which was followed by a section capturing data on the participants' demographic. Questions were then asked about the preventative care participants took out for any horses they had under their care, for example, tetanus vaccination and insurance for veterinary fees. We asked about the participants' previous wound experience, and then this was followed by 7 wound case scenarios, which I'll discuss a bit more in a few slides. Data analysis was performed using both descriptive and multivariable methods, and statistical significance was assumed when p was less than 0.05 using 95% confidence intervals. So the results of the owner's preventative care for horses that were under their own care showed that 13% were caring for horses that were inappropriately vaccinated for tetanus, and that 67% of participants were caring for horses that were not insured for veterinary fees. Although not surprising, if we extrapolate this data, it is currently estimated that there are approximately 1 million horses in the UK. So this would mean that approximately 84,000 are not vaccinated for tetanus or are not appropriately vaccinated for tetanus. Vaccination comes at a relatively inexpensive cost to the owner if you compare this to the overall cost of keeping a horse. And this is significant when considering the consequences of not having your horse vaccinated for tetanus when suffering from a traumatic wound can be catastrophic. So nearly all of the participants had previous experience of caring for a horse and having a horse under their care suffering from a traumatic wound. And over 3/4 of these had experience of a horse that required veterinary treatment as a result of their wound or management that lasted greater than 2 weeks. Participants indicated that the depth of wound was the most influential factor in whether they would seek veterinary advice, and they suggested that the area they would benefit most from further advice about would be the application of topical medications. So we had 7 case scenarios. Each of them presented a picture of a real life wound case. This was followed by a diagram as shown on this slide that indicated the anatomical location of the wound in case it wasn't clear. And this was again followed by a written description of the anatomical location. We asked the participants which tissues they believed could be involved in the wound, their confidence in managing the wound, their confidence in seeking veterinary advice, and both of these were ranked on a scale of 0 to 10. We asked the level of treatment they thought the wound required, ranging from no treatment, owner first aid only, low priority veterinary treatment, or high priority veterinary treatment. And we then asked several questions about any first aid measures they would apply, either prior to any veterinary treatment, or they would apply if they chose not to call a vet. And this was relating to the bandaging, cleaning, and application of topical therapeutics. So when we looked at the data for the first aid owners chose to apply, over half of participants for every single case chose to apply some form of first aid, and there was a lot of variation between the techniques they chose to do. And many of these contraindicated the current evidence. For example, participants were using an inappropriate concentration of chlorhexidine so that it was at cytotoxic levels, and sulfur-sulfadiazine was one of the most commonly mentioned products they would choose to apply. Sulfur-sulfadiazine, when applied to acute wounds, again is cytotoxic, so this is contraindicating the current evidence. Participants with their own horses insured for veterinary fees were significantly more likely to call a vet for 2 case scenarios, which could be classified as neither minor nor severe, and this was a wound that had proud flesh and a kick injury. This suggests that the insurance status of a horse may be a barrier for some accessing veterinary treatment for wounds which are not minor or severe. Perhaps the key finding of this study was the difficulties that owners had in recognising the potential severity of puncture wounds, despite them stating the depth of wound being the most influential factor affecting their decision to call a vet. At skin level, puncture wounds can appear innocuous, but they have the potential to pose a great threat to life and return to pre-athletic function if they do compromise deeper synovial structures. And these wounds require fast and aggressive treatment to ensure the best chance of an optimal outcome. When presented with a small but potentially deep wound over the digital flexor tendon sheath, as pictured on the top right-hand side of the slide, only 22% stated this wound categorically did not involve any synovial structures. And the bar chart at the bottom of this slide shows the rest of those results. Less than a quarter stated this wound required high priority emergency veterinary treatment, and 34% this wound required absolutely no veterinary treatment at all. Older participants, those with medical or equine qualification, or those who had more years experience caring for horses, were significantly more likely to identify that this wound required urgent veterinary treatment. This trend has not yet been reported in literature and suggests horse owners with more experience or relevant qualification are more likely to recognise the potential severity of puncture wounds. Future educational campaigns should be targeted at educating owners of the severity of puncture wounds in order to improve the health and welfare of horses. When presented with a wound that had proud flesh, over a quarter of participants could not correctly identify what this complication this wound was suffering from. And again, nearly a quarter of them stated that this wound did not require veterinary treatment, but there was no statistical association between these two responses. Wounds that have proud flesh require surgical excision to promote wound healing, and this can only really be done by a veterinary surgeon. Participants resident in the UK, those caring for more horses, or those with more years experience caring for horses, were significantly more likely to indicate that this wound required veterinary treatment. So conclusion. So this is the first study that really explores owners' decision-making processes when they're faced with equine wounds, and we identified several factors that significantly impacted their approach to different aspects of wound management. But more importantly, we've identified several key areas for future educational campaigns to help educate owners about what they should do when faced with traumatic equine wounds, when they should call a vet. And these relate to the preventative care, so vaccinating the horses, having a financial plan in place, first aid techniques, so specifically what medications to apply. Perhaps the area that could have the greatest impact on welfare would be the recognition of puncture wounds over synovial structures. And then we need to educate owners a bit better about what proud flesh is and the fact they need to call a vet. If I were to give you one take-home message from this presentation, it would be that educational campaigns on wound management targeted at horse owners are required to improve equine health and welfare, and a specific focus on the management of puncture wounds over synovial structures has the potential to do this. So I'd like to say a big thank you for watching my presentation. The research that the University of Nottingham and the British Horse Society are doing are still ongoing, and we're hoping to have some evidence-based resources with horse owners in the coming years. So I'd encourage you to follow the social media channels if you want to stay up to date with this. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you guys are all staying safe.